Hello, everybody. Welcome to this coffee talk. My name is Mónica Truninger, and I'm a senior researcher at the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon. And our talk today is The World in Transition, Rethinking Societal Challenges and Response of Local Experiments. I'm delighted to be joined today by two speakers. So we have here my colleague Antje Disterheft, who is a researcher at our institute and who will present some of the key findings of our report. And we are very, very pleased to have our discussant today with us as well, Professor Thomas Kühn, who is Professor of Work and Organizational Psychology at IPU Berlin. And I really want to thank Thomas. We really want to thank you for accepting our invitation to be here today and for taking the time to read the reports and give some feedback and also your reflections. It is really a pleasure to have you here. So next slide, please. So we are going to, I'm just going to explain a little bit what the Share Green Deal project is. So this is a 5-year social sciences and humanities focused project funded by the European Commission. So we are composed of 22 partners. And the project is really organized around 6 key Green Deal themes, topics. So, and these are those topics. They are over there. I'm not going to read all of them, but across these 6 topics, we've carried out 24 local experiments between April 2023 and June 2024. And this is an important period because during this time, there were quite a lot of events. So the Ukraine war was ongoing. We also had Middle East conflict. We also had other issues like the inflation and rising costs. So all these events had an impact on the local experiments that we're conducting throughout Europe. And these are the places where the experiments took place. And so when we say local experiments or social experiments, what exactly do we mean by that? So we don't mean lab-based experiments with participants in a controlled environment, not at all. Instead, these are real-world initiatives run locally by our local partners, where researchers take more of a backstage role. And so the aim is really to support and encourage seeds for transformative change toward the goals of the European Green Deal across those 6 areas. And another very important aspect of our work is actually these experiments connect the individual level with the broader social structures, what we refer as the mezzo site. And if you are curious about to learn about our work, we have just published an article, Chris Folds and colleagues, so I was also involved, that came out this year, and it is exactly on the mezzo, what we call the mezzo multiple. So if you are curious, you can look at it. Next slide, please. So now we are going to talk about this report here. So this is a report that was launched yesterday. And so we are focusing on this report in a secondary analysis of these 24 social experiments and across these 6 Green Deal topic areas. And so it is worth remembering that when the project proposal was first written, the main societal challenge on everyone's mind was the coronavirus pandemic. Pretty much this one was a very, very strong topic at the time. But just a few years later, new and sudden challenges emerged, such as the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, inflation and rising cost of living, and even episodes of extreme flooding in some regions linked to climate change. So what makes this report particularly distinctive is that it addresses both the long-standing challenges like climate change and these more sudden disruptions that affect everyday life, things like the war or economic shocks, and how they shape the path towards a sustainable and fairer Europe. So next slide, please. So today's agenda and speakers. I'm going to be very brief here. So we have 3 presenters, 10 minutes each. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about our conceptual lens, the illustration of societal challenges post-COVID-19, and our approach to data analysis. And then Antje is going to explain a little bit more, give you a flavor of the key findings of the report, and then Thomas Kühn is going to offer his reflections about the project, but about the report. And then we have final recommendations, the final announcements. Okay, so regarding the conceptual lens, in our work, we understand societal challenges as complex, multi-level and interconnected problems. Some authors call them wicked problems. And to make sense of this complexity, we draw on two complementary frameworks: the multi-level perspective on sustainability transitions and social practice theory. And so together they help us an understanding of how structural conditions, agency, and everyday practices interact to shape systemic change. So the multi-level perspective of MLP looks at change across three levels: the landscape, the broad external pressures such as climate change, war, or economic crisis, the regime, so the dominant systems, rules, and technologies that structure daily life, and the niche, the spaces where innovation and experimentation can emerge. So change often happens when pressures from the landscape destabilize the regime, creating windows of opportunity for niche innovations, and that's exactly where our 24 social experiments come in. And so recent work shows how combining the MLP and social practice theory can offer a way to see how large-scale pressures intersect with everyday life. And these allow us to identify key friction points, so tensions between systems, routines, and broader shifts that can either hinder or enable transformation. So using this practice lens, we look at how these pressures shape daily practices, who the actors are, and they can be both human and non-human, and how infrastructures like transport, energy, and food actually can both constrain and support change. So next slide. And now just very quickly, this is a chart from a Eurobarometer survey that came mid-2024. And it is interesting that these challenges are also echoed in these reports, which took place just as our Share Green Deal experiments were wrapping up. And so at the time, half of respondents saw the war in Ukraine as the biggest challenge facing the European Union, and other major concerns included the irregular migration, environmental issues, and climate change, the cost of living, and security as well. And around 1 in 5 people also mentioned social inequalities, the Middle East conflict, and slow economic growth and disinformation. Just very about 8% just mentioned the societal impact of digital technologies as a key concern. So it was not a big issue there. But some of these problems, they will also came up in our social experiments. So the participants there also talked about those, which is interesting. So regarding our data, next slide, please. The data sources, that was a huge amount of data that were collected. And so for this secondary data analysis, we drew on all these data, the application forms, the monthly surveys, and then after each survey, we also conducted monthly meetings with our local partners. And then there was a reflective survey, the experiment journey, the interviews were coded. There was a code book as well that we analyzed, around more than 240 interviews. So it was quite a lot of data. And then there were also some tags. So the teams that were coding the primary data were tagging some texts that were very useful for our topic on societal challenges, things like geopolitical tensions, environmental crisis, cost of living. And so when we analyzed that data, we started with those tags. Overall, we coded 966 text segments, which is a large variety of data from all these, from some of those data sources, mostly the monthly surveys, the monthly meeting notes, the interviews. So these were really important for us. And so now we will listen to Antje, so who's going to explain a little bit and give a flavor about the key insights of our report. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Mónica. It's a pleasure for me being here with you today. So I present now some selected insights from our data analysis with the focus on how local partners who run the social experiments as well as participants in these experiments perceived societal challenges. What patterns and dynamics can be observed in the different streams? As Mónica, I guess, already mentioned, we had a lot of data sources, and we coded in total 966 text segments in MaxQDA. And this figure here on the left shows the overall distribution of the three societal challenges we track: the geopolitical tensions, environmental crisis, and cost of living. The spread is fairly even, though cost of living is the most frequent code across the whole data set. And a more nuanced picture appears in the figure now on the right, where we split the data by social experiment stream. Cost of living concerns are particularly predominant in efficient renovation, in circular economy, and also in sustainable food. This might be related to the circumstances that within these topics, questions of affordability strongly shape people's decision. Environmental crises feature more in preserving biodiversity and sustainable mobility. While we don't have a straightforward answer or explanation, it's likely that these challenges were mentioned more often because these streams deal directly with ecosystems, pollution, and climate impacts, and people may have felt or associated more immediately the effects of, for example, extreme weather events on damaged landscapes and biodiversity, or the link between mobility emissions and climate change. Geopolitical tensions appear across all streams, but most notably in sustainable food, where about 1/3 of references relate to this challenge. This may reflect, for instance, the impact of the Ukraine war on cereal exports. And at the same time, we observe that local partners and participants perceive these societal challenges as interconnected. And this aligns also with the idea of a polycrisis, where multiple crises like COVID, the wars, climate change, rising living costs interact and amplify one another. As one participant from Slovenia summarized this clearly, the coronavirus, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, climate change impacts, cost of living crisis, or political issues, they are all relevant. People are influenced consciously and subconsciously. From a sustainability transitions perspective, this means that local initiatives in the niche level do not operate in isolation. They must navigate overlapping pressures, adapt to unexpected challenges, and build resilience across multiple domains. And here on this slide, we summarize the factors that either help or hinder the implementation of the Green Deal objectives. And we group them into clusters across different systems level. So on the landscape level, we see, for example, the structural conditions and the crisis like economic and environmental pressures. On the regime level, we have policy and financial tools, institutional arrangements, and also technical support. At the niche level, we have the community dynamics, social engagement, and awareness. And across all these levels, we find communication and framing important, and these actually link all levels together. And importantly here is that these figures, they can be both enabling or hindering. For example, subsidies can help people take action if they are accessible, but they become a barrier if they are bureaucratic or delayed. So we cannot simply equate facilitators with opportunities and barriers with obstacles. But how do these factors actually translate into action? That's where we need to look at windows of opportunity and friction points that Mónica also briefly mentioned. So we have just seen that the factors that can help or hinder the Green Deal implementation. And in sustainability transitions, two terms are here commonly used to make sense of these dynamics. The windows of opportunity, it's when conditions align to change, and the friction points, it's where the systemic misalignments slow it down. On the left side, we have windows of opportunity, and these open up when social, institutional, and structural conditions come together. A clear example we bring here from Spain, where a local energy cooperative started with a motivation to fight climate change, but at the same time, this also strengthened social bonds and a sense of community. And one participant explains, so we started with a motivation to fight climate change, but we see that the community also gives a sense of belonging to the neighbors. We have created a participatory, democratic, open cooperative, a cooperative of the neighbors, and this gives us a common project, a common goal. And on the right side, we see the friction points and the systemic misalignments that block or slow down action, even when opportunities exist. And in the sustainable mobility experiments, for example, we observed two clear examples. In Sofia, Bulgaria, a student explained that she would like to use public transport more often, but she lives far away, so the available options don't work for her. And in Ireland, school administrators discovered through the social experiments that girls experienced sexual harassment when cycling in their uniforms. Here, it wasn't a lack of infrastructure that was the barrier, but unsafe and unacceptable behavior, which prevented them from adopting alternative commuting practices. So recognizing both windows of opportunities and friction points help us understand where change can be supported, where resilience needs to be strengthened, and how interventions can be designed to navigate complex dynamics effectively. And now I come to our learning points and final recommendations. So first of all, the societal challenges can disrupt, but can also mobilize transitions. And crisis may create temporary setbacks or survival mode pragmatism, but they can also trigger windows of opportunity when communities can respond effectively. And right now, for example, we see this dynamic at play in the political arena. The European Green Deal is facing pushbacks with growing populist and extreme right-wing narratives questioning or delaying action on sustainability. Yet this contestation itself reminds us that transformation is never linear. So resistance can also mobilize new alliances or renewed commitment and more inclusive approaches. So in a sense, we must learn to push back the pushbacks. Second, policies and interventions must align with everyday practices. So programs that ignore local practices or the infrastructures or the social context are less effective. Third, local networks and shared purpose strengthen the response capacity. So initiatives like community energy cooperatives or solidarity actions during, for example, floods show how strong local engagement enables action even under constraints. And fourth, values, emotions, and solidarity are really critical capacities. Trust, care, motivation are not soft dimensions, but they are really essential for resilience and long-term transformative change. And finally, anticipation and coordination across system levels are key. Niche level action can trigger wider change if it is supported by broader governance structures and aligned policies. And here we can also make a link to the governance report that was launched last week. And here too, the recent political challenges highlight why such coordination matters. Local and national actors, European institutions and citizens, they are all called to work in concert to defend and advance the shared vision of a green, fair and democratic transition to a more sustainable future. And very much aligned and built on these learning points, we can draw 5 key recommendations for advancing the Green Deal. So first, it's design the policies and interventions in tune with local realities. Second, foster robust local networks and a shared purpose. Third, recognize and integrate values, emotions, and solidarity. And fourth, coordinate across system levels. And now I want to introduce our speaker, Professor Thomas Kühn, who kindly agreed to be our guest today. And he will provide some comments and reflections on our report. I want to give some more details on his background. He is Professor of Work and Organizational Psychology at the International Psychoanalytical University Berlin. And Professor Kühn focuses on social transformation and identity construction. His current research examines the reproduction of social inequality and the role of transformative leadership. He is leading the Erich Fromm Study Center, and he also contributes significantly to discussions on leadership and organizational development. And his research connects reflexive social psychology with environmental psychology through qualitative and mixed methods, while his teaching integrates these areas to prepare future organizational psychologists for complex societal challenges. He is also currently the academic coordinator of the Social Psychology of Transformation Joint Erasmus Mundus Master Program. Thank you, Thomas, for your time and for being with us today. Please, the floor now is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for these kind words, Antje, and most of all, thank you for inviting me to comment on this really impressive report, which you, in a nutshell, already presented in the last 10 minutes. For me, it's really a kind of privilege to follow you and also Mónica, and I think your presentations have already shown the remarkable scope of your work. So what strikes me most about the Shared Green Deal is that it is not only an ambitious European policy experiment, but I think also a very deeply human project, one that explores what it means for people and communities to live through transition and not just to adapt it. So let me start by emphasizing what, from my perspective as an external observer, makes this report really outstanding. So first of all, I think it's not only the empirical richness or the policy relevance, which for sure is there, but also the conceptual depth, the way you combine the multi-level perspective with social practice theory. And by linking these frameworks, the authors succeed in capturing what I would call the connectedness of transition processes. So not just at the level of individual behavior, not purely at the macro level of systems, but also in the mesospace where institutions, communities, and everyday practice interact. And I think this integration is really rare in science and intellectually really courageous as well what you do. And it allows the analysis to remain both empirically grounded in local experiences, but also while addressing the systemic relational and emotional dynamics of transformation. And also I want to highlight the innovative and demanding methodological design. So integrating multiple approaches across 24 experiments within a really thoughtful secondary analysis adds really richness to the material. And I think precisely because of this conceptual and also methodological strength, it opens the door for dialogue across the disciplines. And especially for me, being a social and environmental psychologist, I find this particularly inspiring. The richness of the material and the integrative design invite dialogue with my own perspective and allow me to contribute with a few reflections that may complement the impressive insights of this report. And in this sense, I want to highlight how the findings of the report also, from my perspective, illuminate processes of meaning making and identity work, which for me lie at the very heart of social transformation. And today I try to link this a bit and highlight it a bit also with reflections on transformative leadership. So first of all, the report vividly demonstrates that the European Green Deal is not just a technical or policy framework, but it is really a social, psychological, and ethical transformation, and one that reaches deeply into everyday life. Across the 24 experiments, people are not only asked to adopt sustainable practices, but to reconsider how they live together and what they value collectively. For example, in several clean energy and energy efficiency initiatives, participants faced the material realities of energy costs and housing inequality. But as you have mentioned before, at the same time, they began to build mutual trust and solidarity. They discovered pride in contributing to a common purpose. And for me, these are moments of kind of identity work, of people redefining who they are in relation to their community and also to Europe's sustainability goals. Similarly, the sustainable mobility and food and biodiversity experiments showed how transitions are woven into people's sense of belonging, who participants whose voices are heard, and how shared responsibility grows from everyday interactions. So from a psychosocial perspective, what Shared Green Deal captures with great sensitivity is exactly this: how people engage in what I try to capture within the approach of a kind of normative identity work, how they build and rebuild a sense of agency, a sense of belonging, and also a sense of coherence while navigating overlapping crises. So especially if you look at the conclusions of the reports, they describe how emotional engagement, trust, and also shared narratives are not soft aspects, but really integral to a system's ability to anticipate, absorb, and adapt to shocks. And so if I link this to the identity work where I'm doing research, I see a clear dimension of striving for agency when the report, for example, highlights grassroots innovations that inspire broader change, such as the sustainable food experiments in Slovakia. We can see identity work in practice, people discovering themselves as capable actors, connected to others, oriented toward shared values. There's a clear striving for belonging. When the report emphasizes trust and solidarity as foundations of resilience, it echoes the psychosocial understanding that belonging is both emotional and normative, something that must be cultivated and sustained. And finally, there's also a dimension strive for coherence when it points to spatial inequalities, for example, or to value tensions that constrain also sometimes sustainable practices. It implicitly addresses how people and groups make sense of contradictions and maintain coherence. In this way, the Shared Green Deal report provides an extraordinarily rich empirical foundation for understanding how identity is worked on collectively and how people through local experiments perform the moral and emotional labor of rethinking what it means to live sustainable. And I think also it's interesting not only to see that, but when you look at why there are other kind of hindrances and why are things that in a certain similar circumstances people develop in another more positive direction, it would be very interesting to link the concept of governance, which is a clear relational category in this report, to leadership. And what I find particularly remarkable in this way is that the Shared Green Deal demonstrates leadership without a single leader. Across the experiments, facilitation, coordination, and reflection were shared among municipalities, NGOs, citizens, and researchers. Especially section 4.2 of the report explicitly speaks of participatory and adaptive anticipatory governance strategies that integrate diverse voices and knowledge to avoid top-down blind spots. It mentioned, for example, community foresight workshops, scenario building, and flexible program designs, all clear expressions of distributed leadership in practice. When the report highlights trust intermediaries, such as renovation advisors or local coordinators, it captures a crucial aspect of what I would call transformative leadership, leadership as relationship building and identity work at a collective scale. When it calls for stable long-term support rather than short pilot projects, it frames leadership as continuity, the ability to hold and nurture processes of learning and commitment over time. Leadership in this sense is the connective tissue of governance. It transforms structures into relationships and aligns local meaning-making within systemic change. So what are the benefits when you look and social psychological dimensions, which this report also has a lot of insights, I think it adds something distinctive to the analysis of transition processes. They help us to see that social change is not driven by information, incentives, or institutional design alone, but the ways in which people experience, interpret, and emotionally invest in these changes. They make visible the often invisible dimensions of transformation, the inner negotiations through which individuals, groups align their sense of self with new collective purposes. And I think in the context of shared Green Deal, this perspective helps to explain why some local experiments were able to mobilize strong engagements and others struggled to sustain it. So I want to do some concluding remarks. I think overall, I see three overarching contributions of this report. First, it offers empirical richness, a cross-European account of how societal challenges are experienced and addressed through local experimentation. Second, it provides normative insight, showing that sustainability depends on moral imagination, the ability to envision futures grounded in fairness, solidarity, and shared responsibilities. And third, it delivers methodological innovation, a rare integration of social theory and practice-based research. For researchers, it offers a framework for connecting social theory and lived experience. For policymakers, it provides concrete pathways for participatory and adaptive governance. And for citizens, it offers hope, not as denial, but as a shared responsibility. And from a psychosocial perspective, Shared Green Deal is more than a policy project. It is a kind of mirror of European transformation. It helps us understand how crisis, inequalities, and hopes intertwine, and how communities sustain meaning and agency through continuous identity work. And perhaps to finish up in the spirit of Erich Fromm, who I was mentioned to be related to in my work, it reminds us that hope is not the denial of uncertainty, but the courage to face it together. Thank you, and congratulations again for the entire consortium for this inspiring and profoundly human contribution to Europe's transition.